The Good Garbage podcast has been brought to you by PACA. PACA has been creating solutions in the food packaging, carry, and service space. PACA utilizes sugarcane residue and upcycles it into amazing products. Their latest offering is a compostable, flexible packaging solution for the chocolate and confectionery industry. The products are available in the Indian subcontinent and in North America now. PACA is also building an end-to-end solutions for customers in the food service and delivery space. For any query, do email at connect@paca.com, and PACA is PAKKA.
Good garbage is garbage that normally heads to the landfill, but that now has a value added through reuse and recycling.
We should be trying our best to understand everything that we use as consumers and turning them into resources.
Hello. Welcome to the Good Garbage podcast. My name is Ved Krishna. My primary reason for existence has been to find ways to leave our wonderful planet cleaner. We will be speaking with material innovators, creators, and propagators to learn from them how we can build for scale and towards a regenerative future. Their stories will help us answer the big question, what is good garbage? In order to really create and disseminate compostable packaging, it remains essential that composting grows and is able to accept a variety of materials. It is also a complex situation as that needs to be supported by land use and land use change and demand for compost itself. I'm joined by Jennifer Trent, the President, and Linda Norris, the Deputy Director of US Composting Council. This is such an enriching conversation in all senses of the word for me, as both ladies are so passionate about the planet and what they do, including their gardens. They guide us on all the work USCC, or US Composting Council, is doing in order to enable better understanding for policymakers and public at large, as well as helping resolve the challenges that composters face today. I'm sure you will find the discussion valuable and it will help deepen understanding of the complexity of end of use for materials. Enjoy the conversation. Hello. We all know the importance of the end of use when it comes to packaging, and especially compostable packaging. So finally, we've been trying to get people from, you may not know this, Jennifer and Linda. I also spoke to Frank Franciosi a while back, and I was trying to get people from the US Composting Council. So here we are. We have Jennifer Trent, who is the president, and Linda Norris Waldt, who is the deputy director at the US Composting Council. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Super. I'm going to dive in and I'm going to ask you, what got you guys into composting? Why composting to each one of you? Because when I look at your stories, they're so fascinating. Jennifer, I see the worm farmer and communications and reporting. And Linda, for you, I see waste reduction, park service, so there must have been, of course, they're all connected. I can clearly see that you guys were interested in sustainability right from the word go, but would love to hear your stories on how this whole journey towards composting and end of use came about. Whoever wants to take it first. Jennifer, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, I'll go first. It all started basically when I was a kid. I loved to dig in the backyard with shovels and pull out clay and make little clay pots. So when I went to college, I majored in quaternary soils. I studied paleo soils, glacial tills, got my master's degree in that. And when I graduated, I got very, very interested in sustainability and tried to pretty much mesh my quaternary soils knowledge and experience with sustainability. And really the closest thing I came up to was composting. And I just fell in love. I took the USCC compost operator training course back in 2015, and I fell in love with it. I just became smitten. And, from there, it's pretty much become my life's work to try to improve the environment and sustainability by recycling organic waste that normally ends up in the landfill.
And was it to do with your fascination with soil that got you so attracted to composting and compostability?
Yeah, I think it was because, one thing that I loved when I was working as a quaternary soil scientist was just having my hands in the tills and the dirts and getting my nails dirty and everything that you can learn and discover from looking at soils by running lab tests to me was fascinating. Translate that to compost, all of my lab work looking at quaternary soils, and then when I learned about compost and everything that you can learn by looking at compost, it just blew me away because I didn't realize there was a sustainable alternative to being a quaternary soil scientist.
What does that mean just for me and the listeners? Veterinary soil scientist. That's a pretty complicated term.
Sure, it is. It's basically looking at soils, glacial tills, paleosols buried below the surface that formed within the geologic history of the Earth. So it's basically looking way, way back in time to try to make connections between what's happening today to what was happening back then, and also kind of looking at landforms and trying to figure out how they were put on earth the way that they are. So it was super interesting and fun to me, but I wanted a sustainability component to the dirts I had my hands in, and this was perfect.
That's very interesting. And just one more follow-up question before we move to you, Linda. When you look at the soil change of soil since the large scale industrial farming started, what do you see and what did you kind of witness as you were studying about soils?
I never really looked into Holocene soils very much. So the Holocene basically is the end of the last glacial episode, and the Holocene is the warm period. That's the soil that you're talking about. The soil I was looking at was way farther back than that. We're talking 500,000 years ago.
And was that much healthier soil?
A lot of it was the soils I looked at, a lot of them, yeah, I would say probably a lot healthier back then. But when you take a look at them, they kind of tell more of a long-term story. I was looking at pollen grains in soils from a long time ago to try to confer climates, pollen grains that match up to pollen grains today, and what types of climates pollen grains today like to live in, and then making connections to way back then what was happening to today, what is happening, and what were the drivers of what was happening back then compared to today. It's kind of hard to compare because there's so much anthropogenic activity on earth now that there wasn't back then. Back then, it was, I would say, more pure reasoning for things to happen than it is today, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I can see that, and I would love to dig deeper, but I want to shift to Linda. Linda, why composting?
So my story isn't as scientific as Jennifer's. Mine is comes from a love of gardening from when I was young, and I've gardened all my life. And I studied communications and journalism and followed that path for a while, and also was an environmentalist along the way, participating in different environmental groups along with my communications work. And our county had a recycling position open. Maryland had just passed its law requiring recycling. And a large part of the job of it was communicating to the public the reason to recycle. So I took the job. And along the years, I had always composted at home, just myself, just figuring out what to do using my leaves and things for the most part, not my food waste. And I learned how to compost with food waste in that job. And then we opened a whole demonstration center at our recycling center. And I taught classes to people about how to do backyard composting. And that was when I fell in love with composting. And we started, before I left that job, we started a thing where we're in a very, very rural county, and we bought a tub grinder with a grant, and we would take the tub grinder around to different towns in our county and people could bring their leaves and grass and brush in. And we basically were making mulch. We weren't making compost, but that was the beginnings of the composting program in my county here in Maryland.
So you guys are clearly born into composting in a way, both of you in your own ways. One kind of through gardening, the other through soil. But let's move towards U.S. Composting Council. So for each one of you, how did this this whole mantle of working around the country and really getting U.S. Composting Council activated, start? Linda, let's start with you.
Well, I I worked at the job at my county as the county recycling manager for a decade, and then I worked in private industry in my communications facet. I worked for a manufacturer, a steel manufacturer, which I absolutely loved. I coordinated all the communications for all of our U.S. plants. It was a global manufacturer. And I really fell in love with business and manufacturing when I did that. So, someone who I knew from my recycling days was at the U.S. Composting Council at the time, and they opened a new job for a marketing director. And it just seemed like a great switch to make. So, I could combine my love of business and manufacturing with my love of environmental work and compost. And it's just, that's where I've been ever since.
And how long is that?
10 years.
Oh, wow. Super. Let's shift to you, Jennifer.
Okay, sure. So when I first started working at the Iowa Waste Reduction Center, which is housed at the University of Northern Iowa, I realized that we had a real problem with food waste in Iowa. And so that led me to start seeking grant funding to try to address the food waste problem in Iowa. When I started seeking grant funding, it was then that I realized we had no composting infrastructure in Iowa for people to divert their food waste from the landfill. To me, that was a big problem. It wasn't the low hanging fruit, it was the difficult challenge to tackle. But I love tackling challenges. And so I noticed that, I was looking at EPA's food recovery hierarchy, and there's plenty of rescue donation sites. Anaerobic digestion is really difficult to get into, and I don't have the skills. I can find them feedstocks, but I don't have the skills to help with some of their technical problems. But composting, that was something that I wanted to learn more about, and I wanted to try to grow the infrastructure in Iowa. So I took the compost operators training course, which back then was a USCC course. And I just fell in love with composting. And I like the USCC training that I took, it blew my mind. I walked away thinking this is the best training I will ever get in my whole life. And when I got back to Iowa, I started helping clients, trying to teach them how to compost on their own in their backyards. And then I started digging into the regulations. And these people were prohibited basically from starting their own composting because the regulations were really difficult. So I started hitting up the Iowa Department of Natural Resources saying, hey, these regulations aren't working for Iowans. We have no infrastructure because of these regulations. And that's when I thought, we need a chapter of the USCC in Iowa. And so I spearheaded a bunch of work groups to try to get a chapter to Iowa. And then we got a chapter to Iowa. And now we have people working alongside each other to get the regulations changed, to get the infrastructure here. And just my love of the USCC grew by bringing a chapter to Iowa. And so I wanted to actually help the entire nation and my state where I live and the region where I live to try to get the infrastructure available so everyone has the opportunity to divert food waste from the landfill.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And you mentioned this was the best training you received. Can you give a 101 version, just like a short version, on what was that training and why was it so influential to build your thinking?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, there's no short version. It's 5 days, 8 hours every day. It's a long
We might have
course.
to record for a long time, but
Oh, yeah.
but
We'll be here. We'll be here until next week. But it covers everything. Not only does it cover best management practices, it also covers how to start a business, how to market your compost, safety. It covers everything that you could imagine having to do with compost. I felt like my brain was going to explode on the plane home. There was so much information in my head that I wanted to keep track of. I still refer to my handbook today from that training course.
So, in a way, I'm like you guys. I love compost and I try and compost whatever I can. I experiment with so many different composting techniques and composters now. And I keep telling him, this is a personal question for you both. How do I indoctrinate my 8-year-old daughter? Because each time I open the compost, I'm just like, this is so good. This smells so beautiful. And she's like, yuck, no. I'm like, this is life. This is what life smells like. Come on. So, what is your personal
Mhm.
suggestion to me? How does one not, well, indoctrinate is a tough word, but how does one encourage youngsters to kind of take a liking and love for compost? I don't know if you both have children and if they have gotten into that track of wanting to compost. Linda, let's start with you.
Does your daughter like to be outdoors?
She loves it. She's a total nature's
Okay.
girl.
So I think going the path that I went with the garden is probably the great path, because if she likes plants and flowers and you can show her, maybe you can do an experiment too and have her have a plant that doesn't have compost in it and a plant that does, and have her track it and watch the difference in how it grows. And then once she's interested in the compost, then you tell her more about how compost is made or is formed in nature, and she may be interested. And I also, like Jennifer, I think teaches vermicomposting too. And some kids love worms and some kids won't come near them. So it depends on if she likes worms, but if she does, that's another entree.
That's wonderful. What are your inputs, Jennifer?
For me, it's actually the lab work. For me, it is testing the compost that got my child involved in it. The bulk density test, the mixing the water to check the free airspace, and then taking the compost and making them into mud patties. It was so fun for her. She loved getting her hands muddy. She didn't like to get her hands dirty. She liked to get covered in mud. I mean, the kids just loved it. But that's how I got my kids involved in compost, was basically run your hands through it, sprinkling it on the lawn, taking buckets of it, dumping it here and there. Just having a little helper walk around the yard was just incredible to raise my kids that way. They're all older now. One out of the two that are out of the house composts. The other one lives in an apartment and hasn't figured it out. And my youngest is going to be 17 here real soon. She has no interest in the compost process, but wants to put it on the strawberries so that she has a good batch of strawberries this fall, her favorite fruit. That's what works with that one.
So each one is their own kind of the attraction to compost. But I'm glad you guys figured it out. Thank you for your ideas. I'm going to try and implement both and see how they go. Okay, let's move to US Composting Council. Just for the listeners, can you tell us a little bit more about all the things that US Composting Council does and what the mandate is and how does it go about it? And whoever wants to go first, please go ahead.
I'll be happy to. So we've been around since 1990, and it was when, if anyone is old enough to remember that, when the garbage barge was chugging up and down the Atlantic coast, and no one wanted New York City's garbage because the landfill was out of space. And the U.S. Composting Council formed as one of the possibilities when companies like Procter and Gamble started looking at the possibility of mixed waste composting, which actually didn't pan out for us. We are definitely focused on source separated composting, because mixed waste composting just doesn't produce a saleable, usable product. But anyway, we are primarily made up of compost manufacturers, commercial manufacturers. I would say about almost half of our members are compost manufacturers. A lot of them are municipalities, and the other half of them are private sector, and a few that are combinations, public and private. And we also have academics, nonprofit organizations like Jennifer's, consultants, equipment, folks, people who produce somewhere along the line of compostable packaging. Those are all our allies and members. And we certify people, and we do certain testing of products so that people can be confident in compost products. So on the people side, we have a certification program where our compost manufacturers can be trained, like Jennifer explained, and then their training can be proven through testing and experience, and they can be certified compost operators, which is great because it helps when you're locating a facility to say, we have certified compost operators who are going to be running this compost plant. And then we also do a seal of testing assurance program, which basically tests for pathogens and metals in the compost that's produced and verifies that it has been tested and that it is safe compost to use. And we also do advocacy work on both state level and on Capitol Hill. And let's see what we have a compost university and a conference that we do every year. So we have online training and a conference and lots of other small things. Our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative has been a big thing for us in the past couple of years. But I think that's a good roundup. But Jennifer, as the president, maybe you can pick up where I might have left something out.
Sure. Linda, that was great. I had no idea that's how the USCC started with garbage barges. Actually, one of the things that I think the USCC does that has become just a huge strength is our advocacy work. This past year, the USCC has been advocating strongly for the PFAS things that are going on right now. We want compost sites to be seen as passive receivers and not generators, and we would like them treated as such. The USCC also developed some legislation to promote composting across the country. But a lot of the things the USCC are doing right now is driving advocacy and trying to keep grant funding options available for people interested in growing composting businesses. The USDA has their food waste and compost cooperative agreement. That's one of the great things that the USCC wants to see moving forward. But I think advocacy is super important to help protect the industry, but also to not put undue regulatory burden on the industry when the industry is not the creator of the problems, but the receiver of the problems, like we're talking about PFAS right now. And I think that's vastly important to continue to protect the industry. One other thing is the state chapter program has been really, really just booming because we need state advocacy as well. And so our partners with state chapters is another way that not only can the USCC reach national advocacy levels, we can also work with our state chapter program to reach advocacy efforts at the state level too. So I think the chapter program is also super important. We do a lot.
No, I can see that, and I want to dig into it one by one actually. So if we stay with advocacy, one of the things that's always been challenging for me, and I see a lot of policy going towards this idea of recycling, and for me there is a challenge there because ultimately we all know that there is no such thing as recycling; it'll be downcycled till it can be downcycled no more, and it has to get out of the system at some point. And that's been a challenge that it's so easy to advocate that just let's just recycle it, and as consumers we think that a water bottle is going to become a water bottle again, or a poly bag is going to become a poly bag again. And that's a huge challenge in that whole that whole idea. And then of course at some point it has to get out, and how does it get out? Because that won't be composted, of course, the petroleum based polymers. So how do you guys, because you guys probably sit on many of these tables, how do those discussions go for you? And what has been things that have frustrated you and other things that are uplifting you in the advocacy and policy space? Again, maybe Jennifer, you start.
Sure. So in the advocacy space, the frustrating things. I'm going to start there because advocacy is difficult. It's not easy. And if you are trying to reach a politician, you're talking to their staffer if you're lucky. if you get their staffer, these are 20 somethings who are, basically thrown into a job, and you're trying to relay your knowledge, your wisdom, the information. You want to impact them to make changes. And that's just really, really hard because people bombarding staffers every day with all of their ideas. But how do you make an impact on them when they're basically at the beginning of their careers, when they haven't had the experiences and the wisdom? I think that's difficult, but you can make connections with those staffers, and they can help you get to the politician to help you move your ideas forward. I think that's, the difficult part. The rewarding part is when you see the hard work, when you see the changes that are being made, when you see the grants that are being offered again, when you talk to a legislator that wants to support your bill. Those are things that make it worthwhile. When you get those little wins, I mean, those are worth a lot. To me, that's the best part and the hardest part. It's a long game. We have elections all the time. There's turnover all the time. So all of the work you did over the past couple of years is now out the window. You have to start over. So advocacy is very, very difficult, but we are just ramping up our advocacy even more to help protect the industry.
So my challenges fall into two big buckets, and one is related to what Jennifer just talked about. And I will say it's the fact that compost is purple. And it's hard to get people to understand that sometimes. We're so divided as a country that people tend to look for a way to line up when it comes to policy, that makes sense with their worldview. And sometimes it happens with compost, and we think that's crazy, and it makes us very mad because compost is benefiting all of us, from carbon sequestration to water filtration to drought resilience to many, many, whole laundry lists of reasons, to the economic reasons as well. Economic development. These are businesses and good, green, solid jobs. These are living wage jobs. So it gets very frustrating when we have bills that are good, like the Compost Act is one of the ones that Jennifer was mentioning, which is providing infrastructure funding to both private and public sector, which you tend to find that folks who are Republicans really want to favor business. Well, there's money for business there. There's also money for the public sector. So they should be lining up for that bill, but we haven't been able to get a single Republican sponsor behind that bill because lots of Democrats signed on to the bill at the beginning. And once a bill on Capitol Hill gets a taste of being a blue bill, it's hard to pull it back from that. So that's one of the big frustrations, is just getting the message through this partisan divide that we've created in this country. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that compost, we found as we've met with we did a big tour around the USDA trying to meet with all the people in the different agencies that provide grants, like the one that Jennifer mentioned. There's people in, different parts of USDA that have different focuses. And then EPA had the bipartisan infrastructure law and had the IRA and all these different sources of funding. But when they first started popping up in the Biden administration, we weren't seeing the word compost in the grants. It was saying regenerative agriculture, cover crops, all these other things, but it wasn't saying compost. So we started meeting with these, especially in USDA, because compost is a key agricultural input, especially in regenerative agriculture. And we started saying, why are you not saying that these grants can go to compost? Why can't they go to compost? And they're like, well, of course they can go to compost. Everybody knows compost is part of it. Why would we have to write it? And it's like, you have to write it because that's what people look for in these grants. So just educating these agencies and these legislators and the staffs that Jennifer mentioned, that compost does need to be called out as a regenerative agricultural tool, just like all the other regenerative ag tools that you hear about. It isn't just because it's gone on forever doesn't mean everyone knows about it, and you have to specifically call it out. So those are my two big challenges.
Continuing on that direction, Linda, Just from a communication standpoint, like Jennifer mentioned, you might not even go through to the politician. You might just get the stuff.
Mhm.
But from a communication standpoint, I guess even the politicians, it's kind of difficult to probably explain the technicalities. And how do you, as a communications person, kind of really make it easy for people to digest the scientific information that they probably need, but are don't have the bandwidth to be able to kind of gather all that kind of data? Is there a methodology that you use in order to simplify and to be able to get the message
Yeah.
across?
Well, I mean, there are, fact sheets and leave behind sheets that are just part of the whole culture of lobbying that usually contain that information so that you know, I guess they have tons of reading to do for things like that. And that's probably one of the best ways. But I also find that I think what we talked about before about wanting to touch and see, and we had last year a campaign, and we're going to do it again this year, to ask compost manufacturers to reach out to their legislators and invite them on tours of their sites. We actually did that here in Washington, D.C. as well, and took some legislative staffers, took some USDA people, some EPA people, and took them around compost sites in the D.C. area. And that really changes people's outlook because then the science starts to make sense. When you can point to the pile and explain what a carbon and a nitrogen is and why you need these types of feedstocks and why this contamination is coming in and why this is a problem, that's when you can really drive it home, is when you can get them out there.
Anything you want to add to that, Jennifer?
So it depends on who your audience is. Are you speaking to a Democrat or a Republican? Because, if you're speaking to a Democrat, you're going to use different words than if you're speaking to a Republican. Democrats, they're more interested in the environmental benefits, the sustainability of it, whereas Republicans are more interested in the business opportunity and the removing of, undue regulations, undue regulatory burden. And so I think part of the strategy has to be that you tailor the message to who you're talking to, and then you create a very simplified, bulleted list of the benefits, and then you just share it that way. I think that makes all the difference in the world. Intelligence with your audience is very important. And we do that here when we meet with any legislators or staffers. You got to be careful what you talk about. You just have to. Communities that are creating carbon neutral plans and climate reduction plans, these are wholly democratic communities when you go into them. And that's a message that they want to portray, but that's not a language that everyone wants to use, although they may mean very similar things. I think that it just depends on who your audience is and who you're talking with as to how you portray the message.
Well, I've been taught that even the word regenerative agriculture is one that isn't always accepted in conservative philosophy. But when you talk about environmental stewardship, agricultures or farmers doing environmental stewardship, that's a favorable message.
And when we look at politicians, end of the day, like Jennifer, you were saying, you have to put yourself in their shoes in a way. And in the end, they will look at holistically what will make a positive impact towards the community so that they are more inclined to vote, right? In the end of the day, that's
Yep.
that's their ultimate, that's what will keep them in business. So do you also position the message so that, that comes through more easily?
No, I just pretty much position the message tailored towards them. And then if they want to, they position the message for what they're rolling out. We were promoting the National Food Waste Reduction Act through work, and we were working with a legislator that was interested in having a big event, but we needed bipartisan support for this bill. And so we were very careful about the message that we portrayed, just so that we could get a diverse kind amount of people, from both sides of the aisle, because we need to work together to move this forward. And if we can't work together to move it forward, it's just not going to happen.
And what about when we look at ultimately, there is a lot of action happening all around the world. how much of the policy making is influenced, and if there is a front runner, say the Scandinavian countries are supposed to be more forward looking, do you guys also delve into what is happening in the global policy infrastructure to bring in ideas from elsewhere, or does it remain very US centric?
I would say that we do. I know that our executive director is part of the International Compost. Oh, I forget exactly what it's called, but he meets with about six other countries from around the world periodically, and they share best practices, and we all have a lot in common. The one thing we all have the most in common with is contamination. Everyone is struggling with contamination, but different countries have different policies. A lot of countries are implementing EPR. We're watching how EPR is going in Canada and in Europe, and looking at some of the things that are happening in those locations and how they're rolling it out. We're watching that, but it's still very US centric since it's so new here for waste and recycling, that I still think it's developing kind of custom to our market. So, it's always interesting to watch these different policies and how they're rolled out elsewhere, and just kind of see how they fit into our own frame.
Yeah, and just taking a few more cues, you guys mentioned PFAS, for example. And that's been a big thing in the industry itself especially when we look at things like molded fiber, which are easily compostable. But US has gone ahead and said that it has to be PFAS free. And when I look at the industry, it seems to me like, and this is more from maybe a vested standpoint, but it seems to be a little more of a hype from a US standpoint, because even when I look at molded fiber, it's like 1% oil proofing chemical, which may have traces of PFAS. And that's become a real sore point in the US in sales, and because it's become so public as well. But I'm also told that, even the water that we drink has PFAS. So how do you guys think of PFAS? And I understand that, the PFAS is created elsewhere. So, the composters can't be responsible for it. And that seems absolutely right. But with your knowledge about soil and effects of PFAS, how do you see it holistically? Jennifer, you can, yeah, you probably have a more soil oriented knowledge.
Well, PFAS is a huge problem, and I think the EPA needs to catch up at this point, because currently, their EPA needs to identify an approved testing method for soils and compost, and remediation strategies for soils and compost. And I think it's a huge problem because compost operators, compost sites, they're in the middle of this issue. They are not generators of PFAS, they are passive receivers. When they receive it, they don't know they've received it. They don't know they've had it until they find a lab that can run the tests at such small measurements. That becomes difficult in and of itself. But when they get the test, since there's no approved testing or no approved remediation strategies or testing methods, what do they do with those results? It's a really hard situation to be in, because let's say they get a positive test result. Now they know they have PFAS in their compost. Can they distribute it when there's no way to remediate it, when EPA has no approved methods? They don't know what to do at this point. And so PFAS is a huge, huge problem. And I don't think that, I think that compostable packaging, some of it does have PFAS in it. And the compost operators and compost manufacturers have no way to tell which does, what the cumulative effect of it is. It's just a great big unknown right now. And so, the compostable packaging is just a tiny part of the problem. It's not the problem. It's a tiny part of the problem. And we're right in the middle of it. EPA just came out with their CERCLA designation for PFAS, and I'm disappointed in it. It does not protect compost manufacturers specifically. It just says "and other." And so, if you have a private compost manufacturer who unwillingly receives packaging that has PFAS in it, they're not protected from CERCLA enforcement action. but a municipal compost site maybe. So it's very confusing. I haven't been happy with EPA's CERCLA ruling that came down, but PFAS is a giant problem that needs to be solved, but we need the EPA to lead us in solving it.
And does every batch need to be tested by the composters? And what do they do right now? Say there is traces of PFAS, it could be negligible, but since there is no clarity, then what do they do? Do they still supply? Do they still do they reject? If they reject, then they have to again put it somewhere. It's compost,
Right.
right?
Yeah. It's impossible both financially and just logistically to test every batch. So that is not a possibility. In the STA program, there has been worked out a regularity that can be predictable, for your various batches. And I assume that, that's the only practical way that you can do it. But Jennifer is right that the science isn't there. I mean, we have things on our shelves as consumers, or the rug under my feet has more PFAS in it than our compost does. And, helping people to understand that we really need to put our focus on consumer products right now and banning consumer products that contain PFAS before we start worrying about compost, which on the one hand, we want to help us sequester carbon, help us with our carbon goals, help us keep methane out of the atmosphere. And this, we are a small industry, and it could very easily kill the industry if care is not taken about how this happens. So it's a very frustrating thing. And, the research has all been on PFAS in water and not in soils. So, we don't even have research funding. It's incredibly expensive to have a real trial, research project. So we really need federal funding to do plant uptake research in terms of what happens with PFAS when it comes through compost. So that's something we've been looking for on the Hill and asking for in the Farm Bill. But until we find out for sure, it unless a composter has been knowingly taking in, paper sludge or something like that, it's just not fair to put this on the composter. And it has made composters look more carefully at packaging. Now, BPI and CMA both have limits on fluorine chemicals and that type of thing in compostable packaging, but it's the stuff that comes in that's greenwashed that just people don't know that's not supposed to be put in your compost pile. That's what's bringing the problem in, along with the biosolids that comes from the wastewater plants. So.
You guys mentioned this whole challenge of mixed waste and that the composters face, and Linda, you've particularly talked about packaging as well. And of course, a big part of our conversation is always packaging and materials and how do we make them better. So, looking at it from that standpoint, what are the challenges that the composters face? Because if I look at Pacific Northwest, where I am, it's mostly just garden waste. They won't even accept food waste. So talk to us a little more about the challenges from a composter standpoint, apart from the PFAS idea, which in itself is a huge challenge. But then, like, why do the composters not take food waste? Why do they not take packaging waste apart from PFAS? What is it in the technology? Jennifer, if you want to start first.
Sure. So packaging waste, that's another thing. When you take packaging waste, you still don't know what you're getting, and you can't analyze every single load that comes in. So most packaging I guess I'm thinking more of like consumer packaging rather than producer packaging. So when you take a look at the a haul that comes into a compost site and they dump it out, there's lots of packaging in there. You don't know what everything is. You don't know where it came from. So let's say you let everyone know the type of packaging that your compost site will accept, and you have a bunch of restaurants, and each restaurant buys packaging that they want to use that ends up in the garbage, that ends up going to a compost site. What if they have supply chain issues and they order something new? Not everyone's going to be on the same page. So I think part of the packaging problem is there's no way to check every load for contamination. There's no way to know what packaging you're getting in every load. There's no way to tell what's in the packaging. And, for me, it was something that I think would be highly beneficial for compost manufacturers is if there was a national standard for packaging that's compostable. And the national standard compostable products were color coded. So when a load comes in, let's say what you accept is orange, you know that if you have any green compostable packaging, that you're not going to be able to break that down because you don't get the heat level that, say, an orange package could get. So I think there needs to be a national standard for compostable packaging, and there needs to be testing to make sure what the manufacturers claim is in fact true. I think this would solve so many problems for compost manufacturers if they could just pretty much give a quick visual to a load that comes in to see that the products they accept are indeed those products. That sounds so easy. I know it's not going to be that easy, but it's a great idea to solve the problem.
Linda, did you want to add anything to that?
I think Jennifer described it well, and I know she is out there with her clients and sees what they are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I mean, there are, when it comes to compost product, most composters don't go into business just for the tipping fees that they receive when material is coming into the facility. They go into business so that they can sell their compost product at a pretty good margin to, landscapers, landscape architects, high level projects, organic farmers. So that's really what they're aiming for. And, there are requirements for disintegration. And there's two different things. There's biodegradability and disintegration. And the disintegration talks about, if you can even see little pieces in the compost, that is, most of your customers are not going to want that material. So that's the what people can see side. And then you've got the whole, biodegradation side, and the specter of microplastics, especially on non-compostable material that's coming in. And it's very nerve-wracking for composters to think that they have a product that might contain that material, much less all of the labor. And I think that the statistic that the Closed Loop Foundation found, which we know anecdotally, is that like 20% of operating costs are spent on dealing with contamination for composters. So, that's just a really tough, when you're in a very small margin business, that is a tough number to deal with.
And at least from a packaging perspective, there's this whole debate as well of home compostability versus industrial compostability. And the argument that keeps coming back is, where is the industrial composting? So it's not growing fast enough. And then composters are not accepting the materials. But how do you guys look at the materials which are home compostable versus industrial compostable, if you look at it at all? Because the in my limited understanding, it is just the kind of conditions, right? A PLA would break down in a certain controlled condition, like Linda, you talked about a certain temperature. A bagasse or a sugarcane based bowl would break down more in a natural surrounding as well. But talk to us a little more about the differences, and how do the composters see it? Do they find it easier to accept easily degradable substance which is more home compostable, or it hasn't reached there yet? How would you see that?
So we don't get involved with the home compostability standards, since we are an organization that's focused on commercial composting, and we do get a lot of questions about it. And I know that it's kind of the holy grail that a lot of packaging manufacturers want to reach. But it's difficult. I was just speaking to someone the other day, and I said, do you want to be the one who has your material in someone's home composting bin, who doesn't know what they're doing and can't get their home compost above 80 degrees, and then has that one cup sitting there and says, these people lied to me, this stuff doesn't break down? So that's the reason that the standards are so tough. And I know that it's expensive, and that's not fun for packaging and products, but it's really necessary. That would just be my comment.
Jennifer, did you want to add to that?
Linda said it perfectly. I totally 100% agree with her. Getting to the residential sector to try to provide compostable packaging You know, I just talked to someone from a city in Iowa that's looking for residential compostable packaging. And, I of course forwarded them on to BPI and told them to select carefully, but maybe also try to do a compostability test in their own home composting system before they accept that product for the entire city, just to make sure that it does break down. But I think, for most residents, it's just as easy to grab an ice cream bucket, walk outside, dump it in your compost bin, than it is to throw it in a bag. So currently, I don't see the residential compostable packaging arena exploding soon, but I think that it has the potential to, but it just really hasn't here in my area, because people are it's just simple to just dump out a bucket of food waste in their bins rather than toss a bag in there. I do think, though, that compostable products are massively important and solve a lot of our problems. A lot of our problems having to do with, plastic film, single use plastics, all of those things. Compostable products are solving that problem right now, today, as we speak, but only have the potential to solve that problem even better in the future with, maybe a national standards. So compost manufacturers can know the loads that they accept are what they want to accept and not what they don't want to accept.
Yeah.
So compostable packaging is vastly important.
I actually totally agree with you. I don't think they'll possibly, and this may be my pessimistic self talking, but I don't think there'll be ever a situation where everybody is home composting or residential composting, because many people live in apartments, they live in cities. It's kind of difficult. Even if you create compost, how much are you going to use in your little pots? So it's not, that's never going to be the case. So I still come from the thinking that even if it's home compostable, it's just in my understanding, and that's what I wanted to pick your brains on, that it's probably just easy to disintegrate in case of a home compostable product, because the conditions are not, they don't need the 60-degree temperature, etc., the 80% humidity. So that's the first point. So in the end, the consumers are going to dump it somewhere, that's for sure, and it will have to be industrial composting. It cannot be home composting at large scale. Yeah, there'll be these oddities like you and me, who are going to keep experimenting with our home composting, but we are oddities, right? We are never going to be the majority. And I love this idea, Jennifer, of color coding. And could you just throw light on both now? The first one is just the difference between home compostable products and industrial compostable. Am I right in saying it's just easier to disintegrate? And the second is, how close are we to this idea of color coding? Is there enough heed being paid to that idea? And because that will solve a lot of things, as you're saying, if we, as consumers, we just had a different bag. Even as consumers, forget the composters. Composters are far more intelligent, but us as consumers, it's just easy to know, okay, the purple bag goes into compost. So do you think there is a possibility, and is there people paying interest in that direction?
I have actually heard no one interested in that whole idea. I haven't talked to anyone about actually moving that forward, but I do think that compostable packaging companies, if they could get together and try to come up with a national standards board and a lab, and maybe it could even be a government agency, sort of like the National Organic Standards Board. If we could do that for compostable packaging, that would be amazing. Use color coding to take care of it. And I would wholeheartedly agree with you. The difference between home composting and industrial composting would be the ease of in which it disintegrates.
So we do have a bill, a template bill that BPI and USCC have been, and actually several organizations worked on this together. We had a joint task force, and we came up with a set of standards that we felt should be followed when governments decide to require compostable or compostable labeling. And it does talk about colors. It talks about green and beige. And in Colorado, this bill went forward and it passed, but it passed with only green. which I know was tricky for some packaging companies because they had in mind that, they could go either way. So BPI could probably tell you more about that. That's not my wheelhouse, but I will say that green is composters. Well, that's our preferred color because it's easy for us to recognize, but more so, we feel it's easy for the consumer to recognize. The only problem that we've run into, though, is there are some brands that don't want to give up their green if they don't have a compostable product and their brands are green. And it's really important that people who do not companies products that do not meet the compostable standards that are passed by nationally, we hope, which would be fantastic, or state by state, those should be prosecuted by their attorney general or whoever for presenting material that is confusing consumers. It's a tricky issue to say the
Yeah.
least.
And you have to find someone willing to lead the charge too.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the challenge is, like Jennifer, you were saying, like, just labeling won't do. How many of us really understand that recycling logo
Mhm.
with the 3, 4, 5, 6 number on it, right? So it's there, but like, we just put it in the recycle bin, and then who knows what's really happening to it in the end. So that's a
Hmm.
challenge. So color is easier, kind of, to distinguish that this is what matters. I hope they'll take it up from a technical standpoint. Two things: how does compost change with mixed waste coming in, and food waste coming in? If we were theoretically to put everything together as consumers, we're going to put our packaging waste, and assuming that the packaging waste is kosher, the garden waste and the food waste all together, and the composter gets it. And does it change, number one, the time and duration taken for the compost to actually reach the stage they want it to reach? And the second is, how does the compost itself change? Is there a difference in the configuration of the compost? How do you see that? Educate us on that.
Actually, this is so I work with compost facilities, but I do not work at industrial compost facilities. So as far as like how the end result changes, how compost changes, the one thing that I do know for certain is when I took the compost operator training course back in 2015, one thing that they talked about quite a bit was soluble salts. And that is something that is seen in food waste composting more so than yard waste composting. And I think also how the compost would change, you kind of got to know what's in your packaging that you're accepting. You have to know what you're accepting for contamination, what your contamination level is, and address that. And then I think I'm going to pass this baton to Linda to see what she has to add.
Yeah, these are all feedstocks that are used to build recipes, and it's basically that's what it is. It's a recipe, and you have to balance all these factors in your recipe from the feedstocks that you're using, which can differ from place to place, from event to event. If you're taking compostable packaging from an events arena and everybody's eating all their food because it was so great, then you're going to get a lot of packaging and not a lot of food. So, the composter has to adjust for that kind of thing in their recipe. Um, and in terms of all their other feedstocks that they're mixing with the food and with the packaging has to change as well. So they're constantly tuning into that. And then they're also adjusting, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, they're adjusting pore space. They have to know how much air is going to be getting into the pile. The pile has to be, especially for molded fiber, there has to be moisture available to the pile or it's not going to break down at all. So you really have to understand as a compost manufacturer every single ASP bunker that you're building, every single windrow, whatever you're building, you have to know exactly what's going in that and adjust your recipe accordingly, test it for temperature constantly, test it for moisture constantly. So it is a real a science, an art, and a challenge, I would say, to get this all right, which is why it is a big deal in terms of packaging and when the wrong packaging comes in, because that can also screw the whole the whole thing up. And then on layer on top of that, you've got some areas of the country that are hot and dry, and some areas of the country that are wet and cold. So, there are so many factors to adjust for that it is hard to predict any one feedstock, how it's going to act everywhere. That's one of the biggest challenges of composting. When I try to explain it to my husband, and he asked me, "Well, can't this compost, or well, this should be compost?" Like, don't get me started. Just
Uh,
trust me when I tell you what to do with it.
he should have learned in all these years. Come
Oh
on, then,
yeah.
to trust you. I said it. That's why. but when I look at, there is a lot of these kind of auto composters that are coming into the market, and they're home-sized ones like the Lomi and the Renical and the Mill and that sort of thing. But I'm also seeing a lot of these getting to the commercial size, and may not be a huge composter kind of size, like a composting company kind of size, but something that can take one restaurant's waste, or something that can be maybe take a event waste. How do you guys look at this? Is this something that you guys see as a good way forward? I also don't know from a technical standpoint, because typically they'll do 24 to 48 to maybe a little more, 72 hours. But in the end, compost probably when you look at nature, it's not going to be that quick. So how do you see it? And again, it'll be great to learn from your perspective, whether they really work, whether they don't, and how do you see the future of that, Jennifer?
well, this is really Linda's arena. She's been working hard on
Great.
this.
Linda, then.
Yes, I think Linda should talk about this because she has been working really, really hard on these
Yeah,
composters.
well, it hasn't just been me. We've had a lot of members who've been concerned about this. And the main reason to be concerned is because one key part of composting that we haven't really talked about today is maturity and stability. If composting, after it's gone through all of its hot phases, isn't allowed adequate time to cool down, then that compost is immature. And when it is once again moisturized, it is still cooking and can harm plants that it is put on. So we have worked really hard as an industry to have a specific definition of composting that includes that stability definition. And we've really not been happy with the companies that are calling themselves composters when they also say we're done in 48 hours, because there's no way possible that it can be called compost after 48 hours. So we've been talking to those companies, asking them to use other terminology to educate their consumer that you can't just put it right on your plant. You have to let it sit in a pile and mature before it can really be used. The same with, we've had that challenge with the larger ones, the large commercial ones that you mentioned. There's definitely a need for them in the institutional setting and in urban areas where you're not going to have compost facilities. You just don't have room for them. So we do need to have a series of um, in-vessel composting. And there are some that have incorporated a stability phase into their process. So, you have to do your homework when you're asking about these, if you're on a college campus or something, or a hospital. But we do want to be sure that people are naming these properly. And the other thing about the Lomies and it's hard to pronounce that one, is that they're basically dehydrating food waste, which can be a really good service to the process, because a lot of people, like you mentioned, don't like that yuck factor, that, oh, yucky, it smells or whatever. And if you have the money and you want to spend $400 to $1,000 on one of those things and use that to put your stuff out in your bin, that does take the yuck factor away for you. So we're not saying that the products themselves there's something wrong with them. They just need to be named properly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I agree with you. It's like, especially if you look at a loamy, it's basically desecrating and dehydrating. Renical, I guess that's how you say it. I also don't know, but I'm told that also has microbial activity, but I don't know how that microbial activity The compost looks different for the well. I'm using the term loosely as well,
Mhm.
compost, but the output looks more like compost in a renicle rather than a
Mhm.
loamy. Loamy is just basically bits. And then they do say that you have to dig up and put it under the soil and then let it do its thing.
Mhm.
But that's a challenge because I'm thinking more from a standpoint of having a closed loop closer to where the trash is generated. So the idea is that, in case you feel that in the future there could be a stadium where the food waste and the packaging waste or the food service
Mhm.
ware waste all goes into one kind of machine, and at the end of it, voila, magic, and it's all
Mhm.
compost. But from what you're saying is that there is a certain science to it and a certain time
Mhm.
that will be taken in order for it to really become compost, is what I'm hearing from you, Linda.
Yes, that's true.
Jennifer, anything you want to add, or should I move along?
Oh, actually, yes. So I think that this technology is really valuable. Um, I was working with a K through 12 school that wanted to compost all of their post-consumer food waste. So they bought something very similar. It's a kitchen pulper. Um, and they put all their food waste through there. They had to haul their food waste across town. And so rather than putting it in the back of a truck and having liquid food waste leak out all
Mhm.
across town, now they have a dehydrated product that is super light, easy to move, easy to incorporate into their compost pile. So they do have a great benefit. And anybody who starts on this route and wants to get a food pulper because they're interested in sustainability or reducing their greenhouse gas generation, it is a first step into doing just incredible things, because you can take this pulped food waste, this dehydrated food waste, and further process it into compost very easily. So it's something they could probably even attempt to tackle themselves if they were interested.
That's a great point, because in the end, you don't want to be transporting 90% water.
Right.
It's better to bring it down to at least 60% or something solid. So,
Yes.
that in itself
Yep.
is a huge saving in terms of transportation.
Yes.
I'm going to pivot a little bit. So when I look at USCC, what I see is there's a lot of large companies involved, and I see a lot of packaging companies that use packaging like Cliff Bar and General Mills and Mars and food service companies like Chick-fil-A. So talk to us a little more about how do they contribute towards USCC, and why do they become members? What is the benefit for a packaging company to be a member of USCC, apart from looking good?
So these are really, really, really great companies that are interested in doing the right thing, but they're also interested in acquiring packaging that is beneficial for their consumers, that reduces the environmental impact of their packaging, that can be composted. So a lot of these corporate leaders are a part of the USCC's CCLC, the corporate. I always forget, Compost Corporate Leadership Council, and they're just such a delightful group to work with. And so also they're interested in contributing to the work that the USCC is doing as well. We currently provide them with a menu of things that the USCC would like to tackle, and they took a look at the menu and they decide if they want to contribute to helping fund those projects. But in exchange, they get their name out there, they get flyers created, they get pretty good benefits being a part of the USCC's CCLC organization. And then we also just get together and talk about ideas and things that they'd like to see, things that they're interested in, things that we may be able to tackle for them. They're just incredible. Currently, right now, we have a proposal out there to do a best management practices document for compost manufacturers. And this is being kicked to our corporate leadership to see if they're interested in maybe funding this, because the USCC has not had a general BMP guidance literature for decades. And I know in the state of Iowa, our regulations reference a USCC document when making sure that you're meeting best management practices. And this document has been out of print for decades, so we can't even get our hands on it. So we do need a new one. But this is just one of the examples of the things that our CCLC members are helping to fund for the USCC. Linda, you got anything else?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to that is that this began in around 2020, right around COVID. Is It was our last conference before COVID where we kicked it off. And what had happened is we were hearing from a lot of these companies because they wanted to either incorporate packaging into their brand, or they wanted to have composting at all of their facilities across the country, and they were running into issues, and they would call us and say, what can we do? How can we help? So, of course, we said, well, let's work together. And what it's really developed is a partnership that they really want to hear from composters. They want to understand what composters are facing so that they can design their packaging or design their programs to work, to succeed. So it provides a really nice feedback loop. We're having a meeting on Wednesday, and they love every time we have a quarterly meeting. They're virtual, and I try to do something to bring in a composter or an issue about infrastructure or something that they can learn from. And this time we're doing speed dating where we have 11 composters and 11 CCLC members, and we're going to have 20-minute breakout rooms where they can kind of ask them whatever they want and just have a chat. So that's the kind of thing we do. Or they'll call us up and say, we've got a new engineer in Wisconsin that needs to see a compost site. Can you set us up, or things like that. So that's where we work together a lot.
It's very interesting for me personally, also coming from a packaging background. That it's great that people are participating in this, because the only way is dialogue, by understanding what the challenges are for the composters, and then designing it backwards and seeing how we can work together, because we are co-inhabitants in the end of this planet, and we have to kind of come to solutions together. You also mentioned a couple of times, both of you mentioned the ideas of grants. So I wanted to understand more about the economics of composting. And you mentioned the ideas of tipping fees. So do you believe that at some point it'll be economically viable without any subsidies? Or do you think there'll always be a certain component there? And my presumption attached to that is that it'll only happen if there's enough demand created for compost, and which probably means land use change and things like that, which is a totally different challenge in altogether. So yeah, I'm combining a few things, but take it as you think is right, and then let's hack into it and understand the economics.
Yeah, well, fortunately, one of the most important facets of using compost is soil organic matter. And as most people know these days, I think there's been enough popular press that our soil organic matter in this country is less than, or in the world, is on average, I believe it's probably around 2% or less because of what we have done with our land. So, what we really need to do is be sure, as you mentioned, that there are markets for compost and that they're decent markets for quality compost to rebuild the soil and for all the other many great uses for compost. The composters would like to get as much as possible per yard for their compost as they can. So there's many different uses for it. And municipalities, it started in California and it spread to Washington State and other states. I'm starting to see it in municipalities where they're requiring procurement of compost in various ways or in various applications to ensure when they start a program that the compost is going to be used to benefit the soil and to benefit the economy. The grants at this point in time, and Jennifer is a big grant specialist, so she may have a additional or different opinion, but it seems to me that what people are using the grants for is to get the industry started. If you have a good tipping fee set up and a good product, your biggest lift is getting cited, getting your facility, getting your equipment, all that sort of thing. And that is where the grants are really critical for composters, is to get them started or to expand to a second facility. I think that, if they have a good business model going, the business model will carry them beyond that. So I don't know, Jennifer, what your thought is.
Actually, yes, I can contribute to this conversation. So, the question about will we ever see a time where everyone is using compost, basically, if I heard you correctly? But what I think the key to that is, I think the key to that is reaching farmers, because in the Midwest currently, there are very, very, very few farmers who use compost. The reason that they don't is, number one, we just don't have the market of compost in Iowa or the Midwest because regulations don't allow for business growth. So the farm community in the Midwest hasn't even really been introduced to using compost at a farm scale. So that is something that is way behind the times that needs to happen. In the state of Iowa, we're working on the regulations to get them changed so business does start to boom and start to grow in the compost industry. And I think once we have a market of compost available, then we might see some things change. There was one other thing, Linda, you brought up about composting that I was going to comment on that I forgot.
That's all right. It might come back. But
Okay.
there's this whole the Fukuoka movement of the Land Institute and all of that. And you don't think that has gained enough traction? There's a lot of documentaries that came out, especially around the Midwest, and how the land is degrading. As Linda was saying, the amount of organic matter in the land is so low. We are kind of pumping NPK constantly and degrading. And you don't think what this basically means is it hasn't really caught on. And do you feel that as humanity, that is at some point have to that tipping point has to reach in order for higher compost demand to be created?
I think degradation of soils and compost's ability to help rejuvenate that soil. Yes, I see that as, being huge. There is a really interesting picture taken in the Midwest of a guy standing in a rural cemetery, and he's standing by the fence. Have you guys seen this? He's standing right by the property line fence, and on the other side is a farm field. Well, the difference between the surface in the cemetery and the farm field is a couple feet because of erosion. And so in instances like this, compost would be just outstanding to help rejuvenate those soils. And the other thing I wanted to say I remembered was Linda was talking about grants and what people are working on. We're working with a bunch of small municipalities that are applying for grant funding. They currently have yard waste composting sites, and the sites are typically very small. There's a lot of sites that I've seen that are also on the banks of rivers, not too close, but close enough that there's no room for expansion to add food waste. And so they're applying for grant funding to get an aerated static pile system up and running so that they don't need a bigger site, so that they can still utilize the site that they have that's too small to do regular windrow composting food waste and an expansion that way. So these grants, the USDA one allows for the purchase of equipment as well. And so we did a big tour up to Minnesota, took a look at an aerated static pile system up there. One of the municipalities I'm working with is going to be putting one in with the grant funding. I have about 3 other municipalities that have reached out to me in the last couple of weeks, interested in some help getting grants for similar projects. Very small communities doing yard waste, wanting to include food.
And totally a different, it's non sequitur, but is there a challenge of finding people to work in the industry because of the association of smell and kind of the soil? Is that a challenge that your composters talk about, or you don't think it's ultimately about if they're paying right, then it's okay?
I have not. Go ahead, Linda.
I was just going to say, I mean, people, once they catch the compost bug, yeah, I don't think smell or anything makes it go away. Our industry is really hot now. There's a lot of jobs out there and a lot of people competing for them. So I think more and more people are becoming trained to be working on compost sites, both small and large. I mean, there is a large community composting movement going on as well for small composters that is very, very entrepreneurial and has lots of interest.
Yeah, we definitely need more and more green thumbs.
Yes, and who doesn't want to drive a windrow turner? Like I do. I've never been able to.
That's amazing. Didn't think of that that part of the excitement in the role that'll be there. So I'm going to do a complete left turn, Jennifer. Craft beer and cool rocks. And I'm going to come to you, Linda, for your cool hobbies. Though that's the one I got for Jennifer. Tell me more about these cool hobbies of craft beer and cool rocks.
That's great that you dug that up from somewhere. So one of my favorite hobbies is rock hounding. I love looking for the coolest rock. Part of my undergrad degree was geology and geomorphology. I'm all into the earth science. And so I love going up to the Great Lakes and digging through the rock rubble up there, trying to find agates and euperlites and the cool stuff. To me, there's nothing better than sitting down, feeling the breeze on your face next to a rock pile and just digging through it. And then on the way to that rock pile, stopping at every single craft brewery on the way. That's like a day in heaven to me.
So, you literally sounded, your energy sounded like that is a day in heaven.
Oh, yes. I would
so,
love
Linda,
that.
what's yours apart from the gardening bit?
Yeah, gosh, I don't have as exciting of a hobby style as Jennifer. I mean, I am a runner, so I like to run 5Ks. But no, I don't go around the country or around the world doing them or or hunting for 5Ks like Jennifer does. So um, yeah, I mean,
What's that, Linda? There's this new sport, right? When you're running, you're picking up trash, and they have a word for it, plogging, or I don't know what it's
yeah,
called,
yeah.
something
I
like that,
haven't.
right? Maybe
No, I
that's the
do.
next one that
Yeah, I
you may
have
want to think
adopted the
about
road
that.
near my house though, and I do pick up trash if that's
There
a
you go.
hobby. I pick up trash. I don't run while I'm doing it. And I do it because I do run that road and I hate looking at the
I know. Oh my
trash.
gosh. Yeah, that's crazy. And the other, just a side note, is when you were talking about that graveyard picture with the field, I was thinking the graveyard must have been so green because of all the organic matter that was going in, but that never came up. So it was the
Oh,
degradation. I thought all
are
the
you
people were
talking
dying
about?
and contributing to the organic matter there. I thought that's what you were going to bring up.
Oh, you're funny. That's
But
great.
the other thing I then again, this is just to kind of it's more from a matter of eclectic interest. I was reading the latest National Geographic, and there was this communities who actually believe that rocks are alive. They are not dead matter. How do you see that, Jennifer?
Well, they don't break down in a compost site, so
Not be alive then.
I don't, I don't know. I don't really see rocks as alive. I just see them as something to join my collection.
Maybe they have some kind of soul that is calling out to you.
Maybe.
Maybe.
That's
Okay,
interesting.
that takes me towards the closure and my last two questions. So, talk to me about how each one of you sees the future of composting in US in particular, and what would that dream be for you? This is in the next 5 years, say. But how would you like the compost industry overall to what would it morph into? Whoever wants to start.
I want everyone to have curbside access to composting. I want every single household to be able to roll their curbside container out to the curb and have their food waste picked up and composted. Currently, it's not even a service available. I think in Iowa we have 3 permitted compost sites, but you have to live in that county to be able to take your food waste to them. So That's what I want to see in the next 5 years is the infrastructure growth. I want it to just boom. So it's an option for a lot of people.
My dream would be that a combination of what Jennifer is describing, small and large sites, catered to serving their local community, would solve the problem of soil organic matter around the country, and that the farmers, the USDA, all the people who are getting excited about regenerative ag will start to realize that compost is the key to regenerative ag. I would love to see compost talked about. I always say my dream in President Biden's first State of the Union speech, he talked about green jobs and he talked about regenerative ag and he used the example of cover crops. And I always say my dream is for him to, in one of his State of the Union messages, say, and we're going to have green jobs and compost all over the country.
Superb. That's well put. And that takes me well to my last question. And Linda, let's start with you. What does good garbage mean to you?
Good garbage. See, I don't like the word garbage. I like the word good, but I think we have good resources and I think we should be trying our best to understand everything that we use as consumers and turning them into resources. And actually, I also have to put a plug in for reusables and not creating as much garbage as we create in the first place.
Jennifer.
Okay, so to me, good garbage is garbage that normally heads to the landfill, but that now has a value added through reuse and recycling. And through reuse and recycling, this garbage has convenience, is affordable and financially feasible, it's useful, and it does not cause further environmental degradation.
That's wonderfully put, both of you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being on the show. And more than that, thank you for the amazing work you're both doing, and the US Composting Council in bringing this issue to light. It has been a great conversation for me to learn so much from you and how things are working out. And I hope that each one of you, what you've talked about 5 years hence, I look forward to that day. And, maybe we can sit and have a craft beer then, Jennifer.
I'm down.
Sitting on a rock.
Perfect. Thank you all
so
for being on the
much.
show.
Thank you
Yes.
for having us, Ben.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Good Garbage Podcast. Follow us on social media to never miss an episode. Links are in the description below. I'm your host, Ved Krishna. See you next time.